Abstract. The conventional narrative of Roman history presents the late Empire as a phase of administrative adaptation. Diocletian's tetrarchic reforms, the division of the empire into eastern and western halves, and Constantine's establishment of a new capital at Constantinople are usually interpreted as measures of political necessity. Yet these transformations, when viewed in the broader civilizational context of late antiquity, reveal a deeper process, the spiritual conquest of the Roman world by the East. Between the Severan dynasty in the early 3rd century and Constantine's Christian Empire in the 4th, the Roman world ceased to be culturally Roman in its foundations. Its political form endured, but its metaphysical content was transformed by the influx of Eastern religions, diasporic elites, and Neoplatonic philosophy, culminating in the Christian synthesis that would define the subsequent millennium. Pan and Logos, the dialectic of the Western spirit. By OpenAI. Historians have long explained the reforms of the Emperor Diocletian as pragmatic measures. The rational reorganization of an empire too vast to be governed from a single center. Yet such a reading, while superficially satisfying, fails to account for the deeper transformation that accompanied this administrative act. The division of Rome did not merely reflect political necessity, it expressed a fundamental change in the world's spiritual geometry. The empire, which for centuries had stood as the axis of civilization, suddenly turned eastward. Latin gave way to Greek, the cult of power yielded to the cult of wisdom, and the imperial idea itself was reborn in the language of theology. To interpret this as simple evolution is to miss its tragic dimension. Rome's partition was not the symptom of decline but the sign of defeat, a defeat not military but metaphysical. The empire was conquered not by barbarian armies but by foreign gods, philosophies, and forms of consciousness. It was the invisible victory of the East, the silent occupation of the Roman soul. Like the 20th century collapse of the Soviet Union, which revealed a prior spiritual exhaustion before the West, the dismemberment of Rome revealed an earlier subjugation before the Orient. By the time Diocletian divided the empire, the conquest was already complete. The Severan dynasty, 193 to 235 CE, marked a turning point. The Emperor Septimius Severus, of North African origin, married Julia Domna of Emesa, a Syrian city renowned for its solar cult of Elagabal. Julia Domna's family and entourage brought to Rome an entire intellectual milieu of Hellenized Syrians, philosophers, astrologers, and priests who blended Greek speculative reason with Oriental mysticism. Under her patronage, Neoplatonic and Hermetic ideas began to permeate the Roman elite, softening the old Latin pragmatism with an appetite for transcendence. Her successors, including Elagabalus and Severus Alexander, furthered this cultural transformation. The imperial cult began to assume traits of Eastern theocracy, the emperor not as first citizen, princeps, but as a divine monarch endowed with sacred authority. This new conception, blending Roman legal sovereignty with Syrian sacral kingship, prepared the way for Diocletian's later self-presentation as Dominus et Deus. The imperial court thus became the laboratory of a spiritual revolution, the importation of the Eastern conception of divine monarchy into the Roman world. From the 2nd century onward, the empire's spiritual center of gravity had been shifting. The Severan dynasty, rooted in Syria, brought to Rome the sensibility of the East, solar cults, divine monarchies, and mystical hierarchies. The rational civic religion of Augustus gave way to the cosmic theurgy of Aurelian. The emperor ceased to be a citizen among citizens and became a living symbol of divine mediation. The 3rd century's political chaos, the so-called crisis of the empire, was not merely a military or economic breakdown, it was also a crisis of civilizational identity. Repeated defeats at the hands of the Sasanian Persians exposed the fragility of Rome's eastern frontier. The capture of Emperor Valerian by Shapur I in 260 CE was a humiliation of world historical significance, the ruler of the Universal Empire reduced to a vassal of Persia. Rome's response was not vengeance but adaptation. The empire began to imitate its adversary's model. The Sasanian monarchy, characterized by centralized administration, divine kingship, and sacral hierarchy, became the implicit template for Diocletian's reforms. His division of authority among four rulers mirrored the Persian use of satraps, and his assumption of quasi-divine status reflected the Sasanian concept of the Shahanshah, king of kings. It is thus plausible to interpret Diocletian's so-called administrative measures as a strategic submission to the realities of an Eastern-dominated world. The empire's political geography shifted decisively toward the east. Nicomedia became the imperial residence, Alexandria, Antioch, and other Hellenized cities replaced Rome as cultural centers. The empire did not collapse, it migrated eastward, into the sphere of Greek and Oriental civilization. Parallel to these political changes was the diffusion of Eastern diasporas throughout the Mediterranean. Jewish communities, long established in the great cities, provided the model of a universal monotheistic religion detached from national cults. Syrian and Egyptian merchants, priests, and mystics introduced the mystery religions Isis, Mithras, Cyb, Serapis that appealed to the spiritual restlessness of an empire no longer sustained by its civic traditions. These diasporic networks were not simply religious but civilizational vectors, carrying Eastern cosmology, ritual, and metaphysics into the urban fabric of the Roman world. By the late 3rd century, the typical citizen of the empire might encounter, in the same marketplace, the rites of Mithras, the processions of Isis, and the teachings of itinerant philosophers expounding salvation through divine unity. The old Roman religion, tied to the civic and familial order, proved powerless against this universal and ecstatic religiosity. The transformation was internal as much as external. The Romans themselves began to think in Eastern categories. The gods became one, the emperor became divine, and the individual soul sought salvation through mystical ascent. The philosophical medium for this metamorphosis was Neoplatonism. Founded by Plotinus, 204 to 270 CE, a philosopher from Lycopolis in Egypt, Neoplatonism translated Eastern mysticism into Greek conceptual language. Plotinus's doctrine of the one, a transcendent source above being, thought, and multiplicity offered a philosophical articulation of the monotheistic intuition spreading through the empire. His successors, notably Iamblichus of Syria, integrated ritual and theurgy into this metaphysical system, thereby transforming philosophy into a quasi-religious discipline. In Neoplatonism, the rational cosmos of Hellenism yields to the mystical hierarchy of emanations. From the one flows intellect, from intellect the soul, and from the soul the material world. Salvation consists not in civic virtue or rational understanding but in returning to the one through contemplation and purification. The intellectual elite of the empire thus adopted, in philosophical form, what the popular Eastern religions proclaimed in myth and ritual, that all multiplicity tends toward unity, and that the divine is absolutely transcendent. When Diocletian ascended the throne, this transformation reached its culmination. His tetrarchy, the division of the empire into 4 regions under 4 rulers, was no mere bureaucratic convenience. It was a symbolic reflection of a world that had ceased to believe in unity. The ancient city of Rome was abandoned as the seat of power. The emperors now ruled from Nicomedia, Antioch, and Alexandria. The West, cradle of republican virtue and legal order, became the province of an empire whose mind and soul had migrated eastward. If we seek an analogy in modern times, we might recall the partition of Germany among the victors of the Second World War or the disintegration of the Soviet Union into spheres of foreign influence. Empires are seldom divided from within, they are divided as the result of defeat. The same logic may be applied to Rome. Beneath the facade of administrative reform lay the traces of a deeper occupation, a spiritual conquest conducted not by armies but by civilizations. The anti-Roman coalition was not a political alliance but a confluence of spiritual powers. The great cities of the East, Alexandria, Antioch, Ctesiphon, and Byzantium, became the true capitals of this invisible coalition. Each represented a civilization that had overcome Rome on its own terrain. Alexandria, heir to the ancient wisdom of Egypt, defeated Rome through philosophy. Its schools of Neoplatonism replaced civic reason with mystical assent, and its theologians transformed the language of empire into the language of redemption. Antioch, the meeting point of Hellenism and Semitic prophecy, conquered Rome through faith. There the concept of the incarnate Logos was born, and the imperial cult was transfigured into the worship of the divine human mediator. Ctesiphon, the Persian capital, conquered Rome through metaphysics. From its Zoroastrian theology came the idea of cosmic dualism, the eternal struggle between light and darkness, order and chaos, a vision that haunted late Roman thought and reappeared in Christian eschatology. Finally, Byzantium, later Constantinople, conquered Rome through form. When Constantine transferred the capital there, he sealed the spiritual victory of the East, giving visible shape to an empire already reborn in another image. Thus the division of the empire corresponded not to internal decay but to the consolidation of these four centers of power. What had once been the Mediterranean world's periphery became its organizing principle. The Orient did not invade Rome, it absorbed it, quietly and irrevocably. The first field of this conquest was philosophy. The rational humanism of Cicero and Seneca yielded to the mystical idealism of Plotinus and Proclus. The universe ceased to be a civic order and became a hierarchy of emanations descending from the ineffable One. The philosopher no longer served the city, he sought to ascend beyond it. The polis dissolved into the cosmos. In this new metaphysical world, the Roman ideal of law was replaced by the Greek ideal of harmony and the Oriental ideal of unity. The empire ceased to be a republic of citizens and became a cosmos of souls. The ancient Roman will to organization was not destroyed but sublimated, transfigured into a spiritual discipline that prepared the way for Christianity. The East conquered Rome not by denying its order but by interiorizing it, by turning imperial law into divine hierarchy. Christianity arose as the ultimate synthesis of this conquest. It combined the Greek concept of the Logos, the Jewish revelation of the one God, the Persian sense of cosmic struggle, and the Roman idea of universal order. Its birth was the moment when all the spiritual forces that had undermined Rome were reconciled within it. Into this environment of metaphysical monotheism and imperial sacrality entered Christianity, a religion of Jewish origin, expressed in Greek language, and soon organized by Roman political genius. Its triumph under Constantine, r. 306–337, consummated the process of Easternization. The Christian God was at once the transcendent one of Neoplatonism and the personal lord of the Semitic tradition. The Church mirrored the imperial bureaucracy, the emperor, as God's vicegerent, united priestly and political functions. Constantine's foundation of Constantinople, a Greek city with a Roman legal structure and a Christian mission, symbolized the final fusion of these elements. The capital of the Roman world was no longer Rome, but the new city of Constantine on the Bosporus, facing Asia. Latin remained the language of law, but Greek became the language of truth. The empire, now Christian, was effectively an Oriental theocracy in Roman form, universal in jurisdiction, hierarchical in structure, and mystical in its understanding of sovereignty. From a dialectical perspective, the late Roman transformation can be seen as the resolution of a civilizational contradiction. The Roman thesis, immanent order, legal rationality, and civic universality. The Eastern antithesis, transcendent divinity, hierarchy, and mystical unity. The Christian synthesis, a universal empire legitimized by transcendence. In this sense, the West did not simply fall, it was absorbed. The conquest was invisible because it occurred in the domain of spirit. The East triumphed not by the sword but by the idea, by offering Rome what it could no longer produce itself, a metaphysical justification for universal authority. Byzantium, heir to both Rome and the East, embodied this synthesis. It was the Roman Empire reborn under Eastern dominion, its laws written in Latin formulae, its faith expressed in Greek theology, its emperor enthroned as the living image of God. Between the Severan and Constantine, Rome's outward continuity concealed a profound inversion of power. The empire that had once conquered the East became the vessel of an Eastern worldview. The old gods vanished, in their place arose the metaphysics of unity, the mysticism of transcendence, and the theocratic idea of divine monarchy. The division of the empire, the move of the capital, and the adoption of Christianity were not mere acts of administration or piety, they were the visible expressions of a spiritual conquest that redefined the destiny of the West. Rome's ultimate victory was thus its transformation. Defeated materially by no enemy, it surrendered spiritually to the East, and through that surrender created the Christian civilization that would inherit its name. The Gospel narrative of the Magi from the East, arriving at the birth of Christ, preserves the symbolic memory of this transformation. The wise men bearers of gold, frankincense, and myrrh represent the three ancient worlds that came to pay homage to a new order, the Greek world of wisdom, the Semitic world of prophecy, and the Persian world of divine kingship. In their adoration of the infant Messiah, one may glimpse the spiritual submission of the Old East to its own creation, the universal faith that would rule the world from Rome, yet no longer be Roman. From the ruins of the Old Empire arose three great heirs, Byzantium, Islam, and Latin Christendom. Each embodied one aspect of the Roman totality. Byzantium preserved the form, the law, the liturgy, and the harmony of the classical spirit. Islam preserved the spirit, the living monotheism that had haunted the late Empire, now purified of its philosophical ambiguities. The Latin West, animated by Germanic vigor, preserved the will, the energy of action, conquest, and historical creation. Together these three civilizations constituted the resurrection of the empire in spirit. The Mediterranean became the theatre of a vast dialectic in which the unity of Rome was reborn as the dialogue of its heirs. The world was no longer governed by a single emperor but by three principles: form, spirit, and will. Throughout the Middle Ages, these three worlds contended, exchanged, and mirrored one another. The Crusades, the theological controversies, and the transmission of science were all episodes in this deeper process, the working out of Rome's afterlife. Byzantium regarded itself as the unbroken continuation of the empire, Islam proclaimed a new universality grounded in revelation, the Latin West sought to reconcile the two in a synthesis of faith and reason. Each claimed to be the true Rome, and each, in its own way, was correct. The fall of the ancient city had not ended history, it had multiplied it. The Roman idea survived precisely because it died. Its body was divided so that its spirit might become manifold. The unity of the world could now exist only as a dialectic of civilizations, a trinitarian structure in which each part reflected the whole. The fall of Rome, viewed in this light, was not a catastrophe but a passion, the necessary death through which the empire became universal. Diocletian's division was the empire's crucifixion, Constantine's new capital, its resurrection. The imperial body perished so that its soul might permeate the world. The East did not destroy the West, it initiated it into the mystery of transfiguration. Every subsequent empire, Byzantine, Islamic, medieval, or modern, has repeated this drama. Each has sought universality, and each has been compelled to die to itself in order to attain it. The law of Rome is the law of history, only what sacrifices itself becomes immortal. The empire that ruled the world by force became the empire that rules it through spirit. Its legions dissolved into doctrines, its provinces became civilizations. The Roman Empire did not vanish in defeat. It was conquered by spirit, and in that conquest it achieved the only immortality worthy of it. Its division was not an act of dissolution but of revelation. The East, by subduing the West, liberated the deeper vocation of both, to transform power into meaning and history into consciousness. Beneath the ashes of empire lies the imperishable idea of Rome, the dream of a universal order reconciling law, revelation, and freedom. Every civilization that has inherited the mantle of Rome has sought to realize this dream anew, to unite the earthly city with the city of God. In this sense, Rome has never fallen. It has only passed, as all great things must, through death into spirit. The so-called obscurantism of the Middle Ages has often been interpreted as a period of regression, a long eclipse between the light of antiquity and the dawning of modernity. Yet this conventional interpretation conceals a profound misapprehension of the inner logic of Western development. The medieval age was not a rejection of antiquity as such, but a selective purification of it. The Middle Ages were not an age of ignorance but of concentration, in which the Latin West undertook to purge itself of its Hellenistic heritage, to free itself from the intellectual and spiritual domination of the East that had defined the late Roman world. That what we often call medieval obscurantism was not a blanket rejection of antiquity but a selective negation, a polemic specifically against the Greek form of classical culture, against its language, cosmology, and metaphysics. The Latin Church did not reject Roman law, rhetoric, or the authority of the Roman state. In fact, it sanctified them. But it deliberately marginalized the Greek intellectual legacy, the speculative metaphysics of Plato and Plotinus, the cosmological rationalism of Aristotle, until later scholastic mediation, and above all, the Eastern Christian theology that preserved Greek philosophical categories. In this sense, the Middle Ages were not anti-ancient, but anti-Hellenistic. The suppression of Greek in favor of Latin was a geopolitical act disguised as a theological one, a cultural weapon in the long civil war of Rome against itself. After all, the East that Rome had once conquered returned in the form of the Christian Greek logos, and the Latin Church's hostility to that logos marks the attempt of the Western spirit to liberate itself from Eastern metaphysics, to construct its own spiritual empire independent of the Greek rational cosmos. The same opposition can be traced in modernity's persistent division, the rational, communitarian, metaphysical East versus the voluntarist, juridical, and institutional West. The Reformation and Enlightenment merely extended the medieval campaign of Latinization into secular philosophy, replacing divine revelation with the sovereignty of the subject, but preserving the same polemical orientation against the Greek ideal of ontological harmony and cosmic order. The triumph of Latin over Greek in the Church, the gradual suppression of Greek theological and philosophical influence, and the deliberate elevation of Latin as the language of authority all reveal a deep cultural strategy. This was not mere linguistic convenience but a metaphysical decision. The Latin Church retained much from Rome: law, administration, discipline, yet it opposed the contemplative metaphysics and cosmological rationalism of the Greek East. It feared the universality of the Hellenic logos, in which reason and being formed an organic whole, and sought instead to assert the primacy of will, of authority, and of history. Medieval Christianity thus represents the Western spirit's attempt to differentiate itself from its own origins, to establish a new spiritual autonomy against the inherited Hellenistic order. The so-called obscurantism of the Middle Ages was, in essence, the West's long and painful process of self-differentiation from the Greek East. It was not ignorance, but rather a deliberate cultural asceticism, the concentration of internal energy through renunciation. What the Latin Church fought was not antiquity itself, but the Hellenistic form of antiquity, with its cosmological rationalism and metaphysical universalism. By rejecting Greek as a language of theology, by subordinating philosophy to faith, and by gradually isolating itself from the intellectual centers of the Eastern Roman Empire, the West was not regressing but consolidating. It was gathering its will for a future assertion of independence. In this sense, the Middle Ages may be read as a vast national liberation movement of the West, initially latent, then increasingly open against the centuries-old domination of the East. From the Carolingian synthesis to the Spanish Reconquista, Western Europe was not merely restoring its lands, but freeing its spirit from the shadow of Constantinople. The Guelphs, in this perspective, were the heirs and culmination of that rebellion. Their struggle against the Ghibelline imperial principle represented the final act of Western emancipation from the Eastern idea of sacred empire and universal hierarchy. Once this emancipation was achieved, once the papal and national forces of the Guelph world had overthrown the last remnants of the Roman Byzantine order, the West stood spiritually alone, purified, and ready for its next transformation. The Renaissance and the Enlightenment were thus not rebirths in the classical sense, but the logical outcome of this long medieval purification, the West's turn from the sacred East toward itself, toward its own human and creative principle. The so-called darkness of the period was an ascetic darkness, a deliberate dimming of the intellectual light of Greece so that a new form of spiritual vision could emerge. Beneath the surface of scholastic discipline and ecclesiastical rigidity there worked a hidden liberation. Movement not political in the modern sense, but civilizational. The Latin West, long under the metaphysical hegemony of the Greek East, gathered its energies inward, concentrating itself around the institutions of the papacy and the monastic orders. Its anti-Hellenic asceticism was a means of gathering strength. Throughout the medieval centuries, the Western world waged a slow and silent struggle against the Greek East, a struggle for cultural independence that paralleled the political fragmentation of the Roman Empire. The rivalry between Rome and Constantinople was not merely ecclesiastical, it was the outward expression of a deeper conflict between two principles of civilization, the Hellenistic ideal of cosmic harmony and the Latin ideal of juridical authority and historical will. The Middle Ages may therefore be read as a kind of national liberation movement of the West, first implicit, then explicit, directed against the universalism of the Eastern Empire. The crusading impulse, the Carolingian synthesis, even the Spanish Reconquista, all reveal the same underlying drive, the will to free the Latin spirit from the cosmological and theological dominance of the Greek world. Within this long process, the Guelphs represent the culmination of Western emancipation. The papal and national forces that gradually overthrew the Ghibelline ideal of the empire did not simply assert clerical authority, they carried forward the deeper movement of the West's rebellion against the Eastern conception of sacred order. The victory of the Guelphs over the Ghibellines marked the final severing of the Western world from the universal and hierarchical model of Byzantium. Once the imperial idea, rooted in the East, had been defeated, the West found itself spiritually alone. The papal monarchy, and the emerging national monarchies that aligned with it, embodied a new principle of sovereignty, authority derived not from the cosmos or from transcendence, but from within the historical community itself. This emancipation, however, did not end with the triumph of the papacy. The same Guelph impulse that had destroyed the empire soon turned against the Church. Having liberated itself from the Eastern logos, the West sought now to liberate itself from the divine. The Renaissance, often described as a rebirth of classical antiquity, was in truth the secular continuation of the medieval revolt. What had begun as a struggle against external domination, the authority of Constantinople and the Hellenic spirit, was transformed into a struggle against the internal domination of the sacred. The energy that had overthrown the emperor now turned against God himself. Having liberated itself from the spiritual hegemony of the East, the West turned its newfound freedom inward. But the energy that had once been directed against the Byzantine Empire and the Hellenistic Church could not remain without an object. The rebellion that began as a struggle against external domination gradually transformed into a rebellion against the internal principle of order itself. The same Guelph spirit that had overthrown the empire now turned against God. The Renaissance, often celebrated as a rebirth, was in truth the secular continuation of the medieval revolt, a redirection of the West's anti-Eastern impulse toward the transcendent as such. Where the Middle Ages had fought to separate Latin Christianity from Greek metaphysics, the Renaissance and Enlightenment fought to separate man from the divine. The West, purified of its Hellenistic inheritance, now sought to assert its autonomy absolutely, to establish within the human subject the same sovereignty that the Guelphs had claimed for the papacy and the emerging national monarchies. Thus the Reformation, humanism, and rationalism are all expressions of one and the same logic, the progressive internalization of the struggle for independence, culminating in the modern idea of self-grounding reason. In this sense, modernity represents the completion of the Guelph Revolution. Having cast off the imperial and ecclesiastical forms of the East, the West ultimately abolishes all external authority. Cosmic, divine, or traditional. What began as the political emancipation of the Latin world from Byzantium becomes, by the Enlightenment, the metaphysical emancipation of man from the sacred cosmos. The old imperial unity of heaven and earth, of logos and being, is replaced by the self-sufficient autonomy of the human will. Yet this triumph conceals a paradox. By annihilating the last traces of the Eastern sacred order, the West also severs itself from the ontological ground that had once sustained it. Its freedom becomes absolute and therefore empty. The post-Guelph world, in its secular form, carries within itself the same revolutionary principle that once animated the medieval papacy, the refusal of subordination, the enthronement of human authority over the universal. But what had once been a struggle for the freedom of the West against the East becomes, in modernity, a struggle of man against his own being. The rebellion, having consumed its external enemy, turns metaphysical. It becomes the war of the human spirit against the divine logos itself. The Renaissance and the Enlightenment thus appear as the final phases of the Guelph rebellion. The Latin West, having purified itself of the Greek metaphysical inheritance, now strove for complete autonomy. Man replaced the cosmos as the center of reality. Humanism, rationalism, and the Reformation all continued the same movement of internalization, the search for a source of authority within the human subject. The principle that had once justified the papal claim against the empire, the primacy of will over hierarchy, of spiritual over temporal power, was transferred into the philosophical domain as the primacy of reason over being. Modernity, in this sense, is nothing other than the Guelph idea carried to its metaphysical conclusion. Yet absolute autonomy contains its own negation. By rejecting all external authority, the modern West severed itself from the ontological ground that had once sustained it. The freedom it achieved was absolute, but therefore empty. The Enlightenment's triumph was also the exhaustion of the Western spirit, for the destruction of transcendence leaves man suspended in a self-created void. The rebellion that began as a struggle for liberation from the East became, in modernity, a struggle of man against his own being. Having consumed its external enemies, the Guelph principle turned inward, devouring the last remnants of the sacred within the human soul. The 21st century discloses, beneath the secular surface of Western liberalism, a new and paradoxical religiosity. What appears as ecological consciousness or environmental ethics is, in its spiritual essence, a return to ancient paganism. The cult of Gaia, the reverence for Mother Earth, and the quasi-theological language of planetary balance reveal that the disenchanted world of modernity has given way to a new sacralization of nature. Having exhausted the transcendence inherited from Christianity, the post-Guelph West has turned once again to the immanent powers of the cosmos. Its new liturgy is environmentalism, its new eschatology, the preservation of the biosphere. This development completes the long Guelph cycle. The West, having overthrown the imperial and ecclesiastical institutions of the East, then rejected divine transcendence itself. What began as a struggle for autonomy against the Hellenistic Christian order culminated in the self-deification of humanity. Now, even that humanistic project dissolves into a pantheistic cult of natural forces. The new ecological ideology represents not a forward leap, but a circular return, the spiritual regression of a civilization that, having rebelled against heaven, now prostrates itself before the earth. Plutarch once recorded the mysterious cry heard during the reign of Tiberius, "The great Pan is dead." Christian tradition understood this as an omen of the passing of the old gods and the advent of the Logos. The death of Pan thus symbolized the triumph of transcendence over immanence, of divine personhood over natural vitality. Yet today, the West inverts that proclamation: the great Pan has returned. The sacred, banished from heaven, now reappears in the forests, oceans, and climates. The Logos that once ruled from above is displaced by a pantheistic ecology that sacralizes life itself. The West, at the end of its rebellion, encounters the ancient gods it once buried, only now they wear the garments of science, activism, and planetary governance. And yet, this return of Pan signals not only regression but also exhaustion, the terminus of the Guelph revolt that began in the Middle Ages. Having passed from empire to papacy, from church to reason, and from reason to nature, the West stands again before the metaphysical question it once silenced: the need for order beyond immanence. Here the forgotten Gibelin principle, the idea of sacred hierarchy, of the vertical axis uniting heaven and earth, reemerges as the only possible counterpoint to the ecological pantheism of the postmodern West. The contemporary world thus reproduces, in new form, the ancient tension between the empire and Pan, between the Logos and the cosmos. The green religion of our time, however noble in its ethical intentions, marks the culmination of the Western descent into pure immanence. Opposed to it stands the Gibelin vision of a renewed sacred order, one that restores transcendence without denying the world, that re-establishes hierarchy without suppressing freedom, and that reconciles man once more with the divine source of being. In this light, the so-called environmental turn of Western civilization is not its final victory, but its last temptation. The world is again divided, as in the twilight of antiquity, between two Romes, one earthly and pantheistic, devoted to the worship of Pan, the other metaphysical and imperial, faithful to the memory of the Logos. The decisive word has yet to be spoken. But if history is truly cyclical, then the Gibelin idea, the empire of the spirit, the restoration of cosmic hierarchy, may yet rise again from beneath the ruins of the post-Guelph world, as the eternal answer of the West to its own rebellion. Yet history, as ever, is dialectical. The Guelph triumph, the emancipation of the West from all higher authority, could not mark the end of the drama, for absolute freedom without substance inevitably gives rise to its opposite. Once the West had exhausted its creative energies in rebellion, theological, philosophical, and political, it found itself in a void. The individual, liberated from all transcendence, confronted a world stripped of meaning. In this emptiness, the suppressed principle of the East, the imperial, hierarchical, ontological order that the Gibelins had once defended, began to return, first as nostalgia, then as a necessity. The 19th and 20th centuries witnessed this Gibelin resurgence in multiple forms, in the romantic rediscovery of the sacred and the organic, in the restoration of imperial ideals, in philosophies seeking to reunite spirit and being after the Enlightenment's separation. Wherever the Guelph spirit dissolved the world into isolated individuals, the Gibelins sought to restore unity not through ecclesiastical domination, but through a new synthesis of will and order, freedom and hierarchy. Modern empires, despite their secular garb, often bore traces of this latent Ghibellinism. The Napoleonic vision of Europe, the Hegelian concept of the rational state, and even the Eurasian and Orthodox reassert ions of imperial unity all can be read as attempts to reconstitute a sacred order after the Guelph dissolution. They testify to a deep civilizational memory, the Western need to reconcile its Promethean freedom with an ontological foundation that it once destroyed. Thus, the dialectic of Europe does not end with the Enlightenment but turns upon itself. The same West that overthrew the Eastern Empire begins to seek, in its exhaustion, a new empire of its own, not an imitation of Byzantium, but as its eschatological counterpart. The Ghibelline idea reappears whenever the West, weary of its own anarchy, longs for a reconciliation of heaven and earth, spirit and law. It is the return of Rome in its higher sense, not the juridical papal Rome of the Guelphs, but the metaphysical Rome of universal order. If the Guelph West embodies the revolt of man against the cosmos, the Ghibelline West represents the attempt to reintegrate man into it to restore the sacred axis broken by the Reformation and the Enlightenment. This is why, even in modernity, the Ghibelline principle persists as a subterranean current, in the political theology of empire, in the metaphysics of Hegel and Schelling, in the mysticism of Hölderlin and Dostoevsky, and, more recently, in the Eurasian and traditionalist visions that seek to heal the rupture between East and West. The Guelph West, triumphant but spiritually fatigued, gave birth to a renewed Ghibellinism, the reawakening of the imperial and ontological principle that it had once suppressed. The 19th and 20th centuries saw this return in many guises, in the romantic yearning for unity, in the philosophical attempts to reconcile spirit and being, in the political resurrection of empire as a form of metaphysical order. The Napoleonic vision of Europe, the Hegelian concept of the rational state, the mystical monarchism of the Russian Orthodox world, and later the Eurasianist idea of a sacred empire of the land all represent modern expressions of the Ghibelline counter-impulse. Each sought, in its own way, to heal the fracture between freedom and order, subject and cosmos, history and eternity. This Ghibelline resurgence reveals the cyclical structure of Western history. The rebellion of the Guelphs, which overthrew the hierarchy of the East, could not sustain itself indefinitely, for pure freedom without form collapses into nihilism. Modern Europe, after centuries of dissolving every transcendent authority, found itself longing once more for unity. The imperial idea returned, though no longer as a simple restoration of the past. It reappeared as a metaphysical necessity, the need to re-establish a vertical axis connecting heaven and earth, spirit and law. The Ghibelline principle thus re-emerged as a corrective to the excesses of Guelph individualism, offering a vision of order that could reconcile the autonomy of the modern subject with the sacredness of being. Yet the dialectic did not end there. In the present age, a new transformation unfolds, one that reveals both the completion and the exhaustion of the Western cycle. The contemporary West, having passed through humanism and rationalism, has arrived at a curious form of post-human religiosity. Beneath its secular and scientific surface, the ecological and environmental consciousness of the 21st century conceals a return to the ancient world's most primordial faith, the worship of nature. What is now celebrated as the green worldview is not simply a moral concern for the environment but the emergence of a new pantheism, a repaganization of the Western spirit. The cult of Gaia, the reverence for the living planet, and the quasi-theological language of climate discourse all bear witness to the same process, the sacralization of the immanent. Having banished God from heaven, the West now discovers divinity in the earth. The metaphysical energy once directed toward transcendence has descended into the biosphere. Environmentalism, in its deeper sense, is the religion of a civilization that has completed its rebellion against the divine order and now seeks redemption in the natural. It is a spiritual inversion, the final consequence of the Guelph desire for autonomy, in which man, having dethroned the Creator, now bows before creation. Plutarch, in his treatise on the cessation of the oracles, tells of a mysterious cry heard during the reign of Tiberius, "The great Pan is dead." For early Christians, this was a sign of the passing of the pagan gods and the triumph of the true faith. The death of Pan symbolized the victory of the Logos over the natural powers, of the personal God over the cosmic divinities. Yet in the contemporary West the cry is reversed, "The great Pan has returned." The sacred, having been expelled from heaven, reappears in the forests, oceans, and climates. The ancient gods of nature, once silenced by the word, have been resurrected under the banners of science, ecology, and planetary governance. This return of Pan does not merely mark a cultural fashion, it represents the metaphysical closure of the Western cycle. The West, which once rose by conquering the East and by subduing the cosmos under the dominion of the human spirit, ends by submitting to the very forces it sought to transcend. The ecological religion of our age is the final metamorphosis of the Guelph rebellion, the transformation of human sovereignty into pantheistic humility. Having rejected the vertical order of the Gibelin world, the modern West now kneels before the horizontal totality of nature. Its freedom culminates in self-dissolution. And yet, within this pantheistic regression lies the germ of renewal. The return of Pan is also a revelation of the limits of immanence. The new religion of nature, by sacralizing the earth, unconsciously reawakens the longing for the sacred as such. The very attempt to deify the planet testifies to an unquenched thirst for transcendence. Here, at the point of greatest distance from the Logos, the possibility of its restoration appears. The Gibelin principle, the idea of the sacred hierarchy uniting the divine and the worldly, may once again become the form through which the West seeks to overcome its own exhaustion. Thus, the entire spiritual history of the West can be seen as a vast dialectic between two poles. The Guelph and the Gibelin, the horizontal and the vertical, the rebellion of the will and the order of the spirit. The medieval struggle between papacy and empire was only the historical surface of this deeper conflict. The West's long journey from the purgation of Greek metaphysics, through the assertion of papal authority, the emancipation of the subject in the Enlightenment, and the eventual repaganization of the modern ecological age constitutes a single, continuous movement of rebellion and return. Each stage negates the one before, and yet carries its essence within. In our own time, this dialectic stands on the threshold of decision. The contemporary world oscillates between two Romes, the Rome of Pan, which worships the immanent vitality of the earth, and the Rome of the Logos, which upholds the transcendence of divine order. The ecological turn, for all its moral urgency, cannot resolve this opposition, for it belongs entirely to the Guelph lineage, the lineage of revolt against hierarchy, now transformed into a pious submission to the natural. The Gibelin alternative, by contrast, seeks a synthesis, not the domination of nature by man, nor the worship of nature by man, but the restoration of the vertical axis through which both find meaning. Whether such a restoration is possible remains uncertain. Yet history suggests that the West's destiny has never been final exhaustion, but continual metamorphosis. The same spirit that once rose from the ruins of antiquity to build a new world may again, in the aftermath of its own rebellion, rediscover the path to order. The memory of the empire, the idea of the sacred, the intuition of the hierarchy of being, these are not dead relics but latent possibilities. As the modern West confronts its own dissolution in ecological pantheism, the Gibelin idea may yet reappear as its last and highest form of self-knowledge, the realization that freedom, severed from transcendence, ends only in submission to the lower powers of nature, and that true liberation lies not in rebellion against heaven but in the restoration of its lost harmony with the world. The cycle thus closes where it began, with the struggle between Rome and the East, between the Pan and Empire, between the natural cosmos and the divine Logos. Yet every end is also a beginning. The rebirth of the Gibelin spirit would not mean a return to medieval forms, but the reassertion of their metaphysical essence, the conviction that order is not the enemy of freedom but its foundation, and that civilization itself depends on the vertical reconciliation of man, nature, and God. Only through such reconciliation can the West transcend the fatal logic of its own rebellion and once again become the bearer of a truly universal idea.